Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you're here, it's probably getting late. Maybe you're already settled in. Maybe the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet. This is a place for that kind of evening. We tell the stories of real lives here. Long, slow, careful stories. The kind that give you something gentle to rest your mind on as the night comes in. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with Hans Christian Andersen. You probably know his name. Most of us heard it first as children. The Little Mermaid, the Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina. Fairy tales that have been with us for so long that they feel almost like memories rather than stories someone once wrote down. But behind those tales was a real person, a man who grew up with very little, who spent most of his life searching for somewhere he truly belonged, who felt deeply and honestly throughout every chapter of his life. I find his story quietly moving, not because it's triumphant or perfect, but because it's honest, because he carried so much and kept going anyway, and because the things he created out of that life have lasted far longer than he could have imagined. It's the kind of life that stays with you. So let's move gently into his story. Gently, without any hurry at all. Hans Christian Andersen was born on the 2nd of April in the year 1805. He came into the world in a small town on the island of Funen in Denmark. The town was called Odense. It was a modest place, not a grand city. Not a place of wealth or prestige. It was a working town with narrow streets and simple houses and people who lived ordinary, difficult lives. His family was part of that world. His father was a shoemaker, a quiet, thoughtful man who had very little money, but a great love of stories and books and imagination. His name was also Hans. He was young when Andersen was born, barely into his 20s. His mother was named Anne-Marie Andersdatter. She came from a poorer background still. She was a warm woman, hard-working, devoted to her family. But she had not had much education. Life had been difficult for her in ways that shaped who she was. The family lived in a single room, one small room, which served as the kitchen, the workshop, and the bedroom all at once. The bed was a kind of wooden frame, put together from the remains of an old nobleman's funeral carriage. That detail has always stayed with me. Something discarded by the wealthy, turned into something used and loved by the poor. It was a home full of contrasts like that. Very little space, very little money, but not without warmth. His father was the one who opened the world of imagination to the young Hans Christian. He would read to him. He would take him to the local theatre when they could. He told him stories. The theatre, even as a small boy, became something close to magic for Andersen. He was drawn to it in the way some children are drawn to the sea. There was something in it that called to him. The idea that ordinary life could pause and something else could take its place. Something larger, stranger, more beautiful. He spent a great deal of his early childhood living in his own imagination. He made little puppet theatres at home. He sewed small costumes for paper figures. He invented plays and stories for his own private stage. He was a sensitive child, and an unusual one. He didn't fit easily with other children. He was tall and awkward. He had large hands and feet, even as a boy. He was emotionally intense in a way that other children sometimes didn't understand. But at home, there was a kind of safety. His father treated him with great gentleness. He encouraged the strangeness rather than trying to smooth it away. When Andersen was still very young, his father became ill. The illness came slowly, and then deeply. There is a suggestion that the difficult conditions of life, the poverty, the hard work, had worn him down over time. And in 1816, when Hans Christian was just 11 years old, his father died. It was a loss that marked him. He wrote about it later, quietly, and with great feeling. The steadiness of his father, the love of stories and reading, the gentle encouragement, all of that was now gone. His mother remarried. Eventually, life went on in the way it must. But something in the family had shifted, and the young Hans Christian began to look outward more, toward the world, toward what might be waiting beyond Odense. He was not a particularly good student in the traditional sense. School, in those early years, did not come easily to him. He was dreamier than the schoolroom allowed, more interested in stories than in the practical lessons of the day. He spent time with his grandmother. She tended the garden at a local hospital. She would take him along and tell him old folk stories and legends, the kind of tales that had been passed down through generations. He absorbed them quietly. Those stories stayed inside him. They didn't go anywhere. They settled and waited. He also found his way to the theatre in Odense with increasing regularity. He watched performances with a kind of hungry attention. He memorized lines from plays. He began to imagine himself as part of that world somehow. By the time he was a young teenager, he had developed a firm belief. He believed he was destined for something. Now, that might sound like the kind of thing many young people feel, a vague, hopeful sense that the future holds something important. But for Andersen, it was more specific than that. It was tied to art, to the stage, to writing. He didn't have a clear plan. He just had a feeling. And in 1819, when he was 14 years old, he made a decision that would change the course of everything. He decided to go to Copenhagen. Copenhagen was the capital city of Denmark, a very different world from the small streets of Odense. He had very little money. He had no connections. He had no plan beyond the general belief that somehow, in the city, his life would begin. His mother was not entirely in favor of the idea, but she did not stop him. She could see, perhaps, that there was no holding him back, that staying in Odense was not really a life he could live. He packed what little he had. He said goodbye, and he left. The journey itself was a long one for a 14-year-old boy traveling alone with almost nothing in his pockets. But he made it. He arrived in Copenhagen and immediately began the process of trying to make something of himself. It was harder than he had imagined. He presented himself at the door of the Royal Theatre. He told the people there that he wished to be a dancer, or an actor, or a singer. He was not entirely sure which. He only knew he wanted to be part of that world. They were not particularly impressed. He was tall and thin and awkward. He was untrained. He was young and clearly inexperienced. He was turned away more than once, but he kept going back. He had a quality, even then, that would define him throughout his life. A kind of quiet persistence, a refusal to simply stop. He found small moments of kindness from people along the way. A man connected to the theatre, seeing something in the boy's obvious hunger and sincerity, offered him some guidance. He was taken in a limited way, into musical training. He had a voice, not an extraordinary one, but a voice. He began to study singing. He took small lessons where he could find them, He lived in very modest circumstances during those early years in the city. He was often lonely, often uncertain, often close to the edge of what he could manage. But Copenhagen also opened something in him. The city was full of life and art and people who cared about ideas. Even on the periphery of that world, just being near it seemed to nourish him. He began to write more seriously during this period. Not yet the fairy tales, not yet the stories he would become famous for, but poems, plays, early attempts at putting the inner life of his imagination down onto a page. He submitted a play to the Royal Theatre when he was still only a teenager. It was not accepted, but it was read, and someone there noticed that there was something unusual in the writing, something worth paying attention to. He is still young, still finding his way through the city, still at the very beginning of everything, but the shape of who he will become is already quietly present. The sensitivity, the persistence, the love of stories and beauty, and the theatre, the feeling of being slightly outside the place where others seem to belong. If you're still awake, let yourself drift. He spent several years in that uncertain space, not quite succeeding, not quite failing, just persisting. Copenhagen had not opened its doors to him fully, but it had not closed them either. And for now, that was enough to keep him moving forward. The Royal Theatre remained at the centre of his hopes. He continued to study, singing mostly, a little acting. He was growing, but slowly. And the city was expensive in ways that made every month a quiet struggle. There were people, here and there, who helped him. One of the most important was a man named Jonas Collin. Collin was a senior figure connected to the Danish Arts Administration. He was a practical man, steady and serious. Not the kind of person who was easily swayed by emotion or enthusiasm. But he took an interest in Andersen. He could see that this awkward, unusual young man had something genuine inside him, something that deserved a chance. Through Collin's influence, Andersen was granted a small royal stipend, a modest amount of financial support that would allow him to pursue his education more seriously. It was one of the most significant moments of his young life. He was sent to school, not a university, a grammar school, in a town called Helsingør, and then later in another town called Slagels. He was placed among younger students, boys several years his junior. He was already in his late teens. And there he sat among children who were perhaps 12 or 13 years old. It was not a comfortable position. He was sensitive enough to feel the strangeness of it deeply. The schoolmaster at Slagelse, a man named Meisling, was not a kind figure. He was strict and critical. He seemed to take a particular interest in making Andersen feel small. He would point out his errors in front of the other students. He would dismiss his writing as worthless. He would suggest, more than once, that Andersen had no real talent and no real future. This was painful for someone as emotionally open as Andersen was, but he stayed. He worked. He learned Latin. He studied the subjects the school required. He was not a natural scholar in that formal sense, but he was determined. And all the while, quietly, he kept writing. Not for school, not for anyone in particular, just because he had to. He finished his schooling by the mid-1820s. He returned to Copenhagen with his formal education behind him. He was in his early 20s now, still finding his way, still living with hope that sometimes felt very far away. But something had shifted. He was older. He had more discipline than before. And the years of reading and studying, even the difficult ones, had filled him in ways that would take time to fully understand. He began submitting his writing more seriously. Poems first, then a short autobiography of sorts, then a travel piece. Some of it was received warmly. Some of it was ignored. Some of it was criticized. He published a small collection of poems. They were noticed by a few people. Not celebrated, but noticed. He was beginning, slowly and modestly, to exist as a writer in the world. The Collin family had become something like a second home to him. Jonas Collin had several children, and the household was warm and active. Andersen spent a great deal of time there. He was welcomed in, treated with a kind of affectionate generosity. But he always felt slightly apart. Even in the warmth of that household, there was a quiet ache in him, a sense that he was a guest, that he was looked after, yes, cared for, yes, but never quite one of them. He formed a deep attachment to one of the sons of the family, a young man named Edvard Collin. Andersen's feelings for Edvard were intense and complicated. He wrote to him often, long, emotional letters. He sought his closeness in a way that Edvard found difficult to fully meet. Edvard was a more contained person, more formal. He valued Andersen as a friend, but he kept a certain distance. The friendship lasted a lifetime, but it was never quite what Andersen needed it to be. These feelings, this longing for closeness, for belonging, for love that was always just slightly out of reach, ran through almost every chapter of his life. He never married. He formed deep attachments to men and to women that were rarely returned in the way he hoped for. There is a gentleness in that kind of story, a quiet, recurring ache that becomes part of who a person is. In the early 1830s, Andersen began to travel. He had always been drawn to the idea of the wider world. The stories his father had read to him, the books he had absorbed during those years of study, had filled him with a sense that there was so much beyond the small world of his childhood. Now, with a little more stability and a few modest successes behind him, he was able to go. His first major journey took him to Germany, then further south. He was not traveling in luxury. He was still a man of very modest means, but he moved through the world with open eyes and a careful attention to everything he saw. He kept notes. He wrote constantly. He was the kind of traveler who does not simply pass through a place, but absorbs it. He visited the Rhine. He moved through the landscape of Central Europe with a sense of quiet wonder. And then he continued south, into Italy. Italy changed something in him. The light there, the warmth, the art, the long history, visible in every street and building and face. He responded to it deeply. He spent time in Rome, in Naples. He wandered through ancient ruins and small markets and cathedral interiors. He wrote about it all. His travels helped shape the books that followed. Italy, especially, became important to him, and it helped inspire one of his early novels, The Improvisatore. It was not a simple travel book. It was a novel shaped by travel, memory, and feeling. It found readers. Not a great flood of them, but enough. And it confirmed something for him. And his way of seeing the world, that slightly sideways, quietly poetic, emotionally honest way of his, was something that could connect with people. He returned to Denmark. He continued to write. He tried his hand at novels, at plays. He worked across different forms with the restless energy of someone who is still searching for where they truly belong. His novels were read. Some were admired. But they were not the thing that would define him. That was still coming. It arrived almost quietly. In 1835, Hans Christian Andersen published a small collection of stories. They were called fairy tales, told for children. There were only 4 of them in that first slim volume: The Tinderbox, Little Claus and Big Claus, The Princess and the Pea, Little Ida's Flowers. They were short. They were simple in their language. They were not written in the formal literary style that serious Danish literature was supposed to use. They were written the way someone might tell a story to a child sitting beside them. And they were, in their quiet way, extraordinary. The critics were not immediately certain what to make of them. Some were dismissive. They felt the stories were too simple, too slight, not serious enough to be considered real literature. But readers responded differently. Children loved them immediately. And adults found, when they sat with them, that there was more inside these simple stories than they had first expected. There was sadness in them, real sadness, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits quietly in the corner of a story and waits to be felt. There was kindness and strangeness and a deep understanding of what it feels like to be overlooked, to be the one who doesn't quite fit. Andersen knew that feeling from the inside. He had lived it, and it came through in every story he told. He kept writing them. Over the following years, more collections followed. More stories emerged. The Little Mermaid came in 1837. That story, perhaps more than any other, holds something of Andersen's inner life. A creature who exists between worlds, who longs for something she can never fully have, who gives up everything for love, and finds that love does not return the gift in the same way. It is a painful story if you sit with it long enough. And yet, it is also beautiful. Andersen did not give it a happy ending. Not in the original. The Little Mermaid does not get the prince. She dissolves into sea foam. He was not interested in comfort for its own sake. He was interested in truth. The Ugly Duckling came a few years later. That story is perhaps the most personal of all. A creature born into the wrong place, surrounded by others who cannot see what he really is, who spends years feeling wrong and out of place, and who eventually discovers that he was never what he thought he was, that he was something else entirely, something that had its own kind of beauty. It is not hard to see Andersen in that story. The boy from Odense, tall and awkward, sensitive and strange, who did not fit and knew it, who carried that feeling through decades of his life, and who eventually found in his own way that the strangeness was not a flaw. It was the source of everything. By the late 1830s and into the 1840s, his reputation was growing, not just in Denmark, across Europe. His stories were being translated into German, into English, into other languages. They were finding readers in countries he had never visited. He was becoming, slowly and somewhat to his own surprise, famous. But fame did not settle him. He continued to travel. He could not stay still for very long. He moved through Europe with a restless, searching quality. He visited Germany often. He went to England, to France, to other parts of Scandinavia. He met remarkable people along the way. One of those people was Charles Dickens. Andersen admired Dickens enormously. There was something in Dickens's writing, that warmth toward ordinary people, that attention to those who were overlooked and struggling. that resonated deeply with what Andersen was doing in his own work. They met, eventually. They corresponded. For a time, there was a genuine warmth between them. Andersen later visited Dickens in England. He stayed at his home. The visit lasted longer than Dickens had expected, or perhaps wanted. And after Andersen left, Dickens was said to have remarked, with some quiet exasperation, that he hoped never to see him again. It was a reminder, perhaps, that Andersen's intensity could be difficult to live alongside. He needed a great deal from people, and most people, in the end, had a limit. His stories kept coming. Thumbelina, the Snow Queen, the Red Shoes, the Steadfast Tin Soldier, the Girl Who Trod on a Loaf, each one different in its texture and feeling, each one carrying something of the world inside it. The Snow Queen, in particular, stands apart. It is a long story, longer and more elaborate than many of the others. A girl travels across a vast, cold world to find her friend. She passes through strange landscapes and meets unusual figures along the way. It is a story about loyalty and love, and the warmth that survives even in the coldest places. It has endured. Long after Andersen's own time, it continues to find new readers and new forms. The steady, gentle presence of his imagination in these stories never quite fades. He was in his 40s now. The restlessness had not left him, but there was something steadier underneath it, a kind of quiet confidence that had come slowly, through years of work and persistence. He was not the uncertain boy from Odense anymore. He was known, respected, read across continents, and yet, privately, he remained much the same. He still longed for closeness. He still felt, in many rooms and many gatherings, slightly outside of things. He was celebrated, yes. But celebration is not the same as belonging. He continued to write. He continued to travel. And he continued, in his own quiet way, to observe the world with that particular attention of his. That gentle, sideways way of seeing. The 1840s were a productive decade for him. He was writing stories at a steady pace. He was also working on plays, on novels, on travel writing. He was never a person who sat still creatively, even when his personal life felt uncertain. He had a complicated relationship with Denmark itself. He was celebrated abroad, in many ways, before he was fully celebrated at home. There were critics in Denmark who remained cool toward him, who felt his work was too simple, too popular, too easy. That tension was not new to him. He had been underestimated before. He had been told, more than once, that he was not serious enough to matter. And each time, he had simply continued. There is something worth sitting with in that. Not bitterness, not defiance. Just a quiet, steady continuation. He made his way to various corners of Europe during these years. He visited the German states often. He felt at home in certain parts of Germany in a way that was hard to explain. The landscape, the culture, the warmth he received from readers there. He visited Weimar at one point, a city that had been home to Goethe and Schiller, a place that carried a weight of literary history in its streets and buildings. He was received warmly there. There was something meaningful in that for him, to be welcomed in a place he had long admired from a distance. He also spent time in the Danish countryside during these years. He was a regular guest at the manor houses of various Danish aristocrats and landowners. He was welcomed into those households in a particular way, as a celebrated guest, as someone whose company was valued. He enjoyed those visits, the calm of the countryside, the gardens, the slower rhythm of life away from the city. But he was always a guest. He never had a home of his own, in the full sense of that word. He lived in rented rooms for most of his life. He moved between the houses of friends and patrons. He carried his world with him in trunks and bags and notebooks. It was a kind of freedom, perhaps, but it was also a kind of loneliness. One of the households he visited regularly was Glorup Manor on the island of Funen. It was not far, in one sense, from where he had grown up, from the small town of Odense and its narrow streets and that one-room home. But it was a world away in every other sense. The manor was elegant. The grounds were beautiful. The family who owned it received him with genuine warmth. He spent long summers there, walking in the gardens, writing at a quiet desk, looking out at the landscape of the island where his life had begun. There must have been something strange and tender in that, to have come so far and yet to find himself, in these later years, back on the same island, walking under the same Danish sky. Through the 1840s and into the 1850s, his international reputation continued to grow. England was particularly enthusiastic about his work. His stories had been translated there and found a wide and devoted readership. He was admired in literary circles and by ordinary readers alike. His name was known in households across the country. When he visited England, he was received with real warmth. He found the country fascinating. The energy of it, the scale of the cities, the particular quality of English life that was so different from what he knew at home. He visited London. He saw the great exhibitions of the time. He walked through the city with that open, attentive quality he brought to everything. And he met people, writers, artists, thinkers. He was not a person who stood apart at gatherings. He engaged. He was curious. He asked questions. He listened. Even if afterward, he sometimes felt that familiar ache of having been present without quite belonging. His visit to Dickens was perhaps the most significant of his English encounters. Charles Dickens was, by this point, one of the most celebrated writers in the world, and Andersen felt a real kinship with him, a sense that they were, in some essential way, working in the same direction. Both of them cared about people who were overlooked. Both of them had come from modest beginnings. Both of them had used their art to speak to the hearts of ordinary readers. The visit, as mentioned earlier, did not end as warmly as it had begun. Andersen stayed at Dickens's home for several weeks. He was not always an easy guest. He was emotional. He needed reassurance. He sometimes found it difficult to read the signals that told a more socially attuned person when they had overstayed their welcome. When he finally left, Dickens wrote those now rather famous words that were not kind. Andersen, for his part, may not have fully understood how the visit had landed. Or perhaps he did, and simply carried it quietly. He was used, after all, to not being quite what people expected. His stories from the 1850s show a deepening. The early tales had been bright and strange and full of folk energy. The later ones carried more weight, more shadow, more of the complexity of a life that had been long and rich and not without pain. There was, in the peat bog, quiet and eerie. There was something, a gentle meditation on what it means to do something meaningful with a life. There was the story of a mother, which is almost unbearably tender in its depiction of a mother's love. He was not softening as he aged. If anything, he was going deeper. He was also, during this period, one of the most recognizable figures in Europe That is not an exaggeration. He was tall, distinctive looking. He had that slightly unusual face that people remembered, and he moved through the world in a way that attracted attention. He was comfortable by now in the company of royalty and aristocracy. He had spent enough time in those circles to move through them without too much anxiety. He visited the court of various European rulers. He was received by kings and queens and princes. He was treated as a significant figure. And yet, by all accounts, he never quite shed that quality of the outsider. Even in the grandest room, even at the most elegant table, there was something in him that remained the boy from the one-room house, the shoemaker's son, the child who had grown up with almost nothing. He was aware of how far he had come. He never forgot where he had started. He continued to produce new fairy tales through the 1850s and into the 1860s. The rate of production slowed a little. He was older now. The energy of his earlier decades had settled into something more considered, but the quality remained. He was still capable, even in these later years, of producing something that would stop a reader quietly. He was also, by now, beginning to reflect more consciously on his own life. He had always kept diaries, detailed personal records of his days and his thoughts and his feelings. He had always been a writer in every moment, not just at the desk. Now he began to think about the shape of the whole thing, the long arc of a life that had started in a single room in Odense and had carried him across Europe and into the company of some of the most celebrated people of his time. He had written autobiographical accounts before, but in these later years, the reflection became deeper. He was trying to understand his own story, in the way, perhaps, that all of us eventually try to do. Denmark itself was changing during these decades. The political landscape of Europe was shifting throughout the mid-19th century. There were revolutions, conflicts, changes of government across the continent. Denmark was not untouched by these movements. Andersen followed events with attention. He was not by nature a political writer. He did not use his stories as direct commentary on the events of his time, but he was not indifferent to the world around him. He cared about the people in it, about the ordinary, struggling, quietly heroic people who appear again and again in his tales. The servant girl, the poor student, the soldier with nothing in his pockets, the child who is cold and alone. These figures came from something real in him. They were the people he had known, the world he had come from, and no amount of time in elegant drawing rooms had made him forget them. By the 1860s, he was in his late 50s and early 60s. He became one of the most widely translated authors in the world. His stories existed in dozens of languages. They were being read by children and adults on every continent. They had taken on a life entirely independent of their creator. He found that strange, perhaps, and moving. The tales had left him. They belonged to the world now. He continued to travel, though less energetically than before. His health was beginning, slowly, to place limits on him. He still visited the country houses he loved. He still sat in gardens and looked out at quiet landscapes. He still wrote, though with more difficulty than before. And he still felt, in the quieter moments, that familiar ache, that sense of having loved deeply and not always been met in the same way. He had never found the closeness he had always wanted, but he had made something that had reached into the lives of millions of people he would never meet. something that had given comfort and beauty and strangeness to children falling asleep in countries he had never seen. There is a particular kind of legacy in that, quiet and vast at the same time. And in the gentle hours of the night, it feels like exactly the right kind. The 1860s moved slowly for him. Not unhappily, but slowly. He was in his late 50s now. The great restless energy of his middle years had gentled. He still moved through the world. He still visited friends and traveled when he could. But there was a different quality to it now, a more reflective one. He had begun to look back more than forward. Not with regret, exactly, but with the kind of quiet attention a person gives to a life when they sense that more of it lies behind them than ahead. He spent time in Copenhagen. He walked the streets of the city that had first received him as a 14-year-old boy, with empty pockets and enormous hopes. So much had changed, and in some ways, so little. He was still in rented rooms, still without a home of his own, still moving between the households of friends. But the city knew him now. Denmark knew him. The world knew him. He had a small group of friends who remained constant through these years. The Collin family, above all. Jonas Collin had died some years earlier, but the connections Andersen had formed with that household endured. Edvard Collin, the son he had loved so deeply and sometimes painfully, remained in his life. Their friendship had settled into something more, even over time, less anguished than it had been in the early years, more comfortable, the kind of long friendship that has moved past its difficult passages and found a quieter ground. He valued it greatly. He valued all the connections that had lasted, because he knew by now how rare that was. He continued to write. The pace was slower, but the work was still there. He produced new stories in the 1860s that carried a different weight than the earlier ones. There was a greater awareness of time in them, of endings, of the way things pass. Not morbidly, not heavily, but with a kind of tender honesty that only comes from having lived a long time and paid close attention. One of his later stories, The Snowman, is a gentle meditation on longing. A snowman stands in the cold and looks through a window at the warm glow of a stove inside. He yearns for it in a way he cannot fully explain. He is drawn to the warmth with everything he has. And of course, when the warmth finally comes to him, it destroys him. It is a simple story, and it contains more than it appears to. He had always been drawn to the idea of transformation. So many of his stories are about things becoming other things. The ugly duckling becoming a swan, the tin soldier melting in the fire, the mermaid dissolving into foam, the snowman undone by warmth. Something goes in as one thing and comes out as another, or does not come out at all. There is a spiritual quality to that, perhaps. A sense that change, even painful change, is part of the nature of things. He had changed so much himself, from the child in the one-room house to the celebrated figure moving through the courts of Europe. And yet, underneath all that change, something had remained entirely constant. The sensitivity, the longing, the way of seeing the world that was entirely his own. He thought often, in these later years, about his childhood, about Odense, about his father reading to him by lamplight, about his grandmother and her folk stories in the garden of the hospital, about the small puppet theatre he had made with his own hands as a boy, the paper figures and their tiny costumes. He had never really left that world behind. Everything he had written, in some essential way, had come from it. The fairy tales were not a departure from that small, simple childhood. They were its fullest expression. His health declined gradually through the late 1860s and into the early 1870s. He had always been a somewhat anxious person in relation to his health. He worried about illness. He was careful and attentive to his body in the way that sensitive people sometimes are. But now the concern was more grounded. He had falls. He had periods of illness that took longer to recover from than they once had. He was still recognizably himself, still curious, still warm, still capable of the long conversations and deep connections that had always characterized him. But the energy was diminishing, slowly and gently, as it does. He spent time, in these final years, at the home of a family called the Melchiors. Moritz Melchior was a Copenhagen merchant, a wealthy and generous man. His wife, Dorothea, was warm and attentive and genuinely devoted to Andersen's comfort and well-being. They opened their home to him fully. He had his own rooms there. He was cared for. He was surrounded by kindness. It was, in a sense, the closest thing to a home of his own that he had known in a very long time, perhaps ever. He spent long hours in the garden there, looking out at the water, sitting quietly in the way of someone who has made a kind of peace with things. He still wrote a little. He still received visitors. He was still, even in these diminished circumstances, a presence. But the great creative outpouring was behind him now. The stories had been told. He had produced, over the course of his writing life, more than 150 fairy tales and stories. 150. Each one different. Each one carrying its own particular world inside it. Some had been celebrated immediately. Others had been overlooked and discovered later. Some had become so deeply embedded in the culture of childhood that people no longer thought of them as having been written by anyone at all. They had simply always been there. The way that certain things feel when they are true enough. In his final years, there was a project that meant a great deal to him. A museum, a collection, an effort to gather and preserve the record of his life. He was aware, by now, that his life had been remarkable, not in a boastful way, just honestly. He knew that he had come from nothing, and he knew what he had made. He cooperated with those who wanted to document it. He was generous with his letters and his diaries and his recollections. He wanted the story to be known, not for vanity, exactly, but because he believed the story had meaning, that a life like his, starting where it had started and arriving where it had arrived, was worth understanding. He was right about that. The city of Odense had by this time fully embraced him. The town that had once been simply the place he came from had become, in the wider world, the place where Hans Christian Andersen was born. It had a different meaning now. He returned there, in one of his later visits, to a reception that was warm and full. The streets he had walked as a small, awkward, dreaming child were now streets that knew his name. People gathered to see him. Children looked up at him with the particular attention children give to someone who has made something they love. It must have moved him. That small loop, from the one-room house to the wider world and back again. He died on the 4th of August in the year 1875. He was 70 years old. He died at the home of the Melchior family, in the comfortable rooms they had given him. He had not been well for some time. The decline had been gradual, and when the end came, it came quietly. He had been surrounded, in those final weeks and months, by people who cared for him genuinely. It was a gentle ending, as endings go. He was buried in Copenhagen, in the Assistens Cemetery. It is a beautiful place, quiet and green. Other significant figures of Danish cultural life are buried there. He rests there still. The world responded to his death with the kind of recognition that confirmed what his life had already suggested. He was mourned widely. Tributes came from across Europe and beyond. The King of Denmark attended his funeral, along with many others. The boy who had arrived in Copenhagen with nothing, who had been turned away from theatre doors, who had been told he had no talent and no future, was buried as a national figure, as something more than that. What he left behind is difficult to fully measure. The stories, of course, more than 150 of them, translated into more languages than almost any other author in history. That number is worth pausing on. More languages than almost any other author who has ever lived. His words have been read by children in countries that did not exist when he was alive. They have been told and retold and illustrated and adapted and transformed into films and plays and ballets and operas. They keep going. They show no sign of stopping. But beyond the stories themselves, there is something else he left behind. A way of seeing, a particular quality of attention, the willingness to look at the small and the overlooked and the strange and find something worth caring about there. The tin soldier with one leg, the little match girl alone in the cold, the ugly duckling who does not yet know what he is. These are not grand figures. They are quiet ones. And Andersen's great gift was his ability to look at them with complete seriousness, to give them the full weight of his attention and his feeling, to say, in story after story, that these lives matter, that these small, struggling, overlooked lives are worth the telling. There is something in that which stays with me. He was never the most powerful person in any room he entered. He was never the wealthiest, never the most socially secure. He was always, in some essential way, the boy from Odense, the shoemaker's son, the one who did not quite fit. And it was precisely that quality that gave him everything. His outsider's eye, his tender attention, his ability to feel things deeply and then find a way to put those feelings into a story that someone else could carry with them. He turned his particular kind of loneliness into something universal. And in doing so, he made himself, quietly and without quite intending to, one of the most beloved figures in the history of human storytelling. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a child is being told one of his stories. Maybe the Ugly Duckling, maybe Thumbelina, maybe the Snow Queen, with its vast cold landscape and its small, warm-hearted girl who will not give up. They don't know who Hans Christian Andersen was. They don't know about the one-room house, or the long journey to Copenhagen, or the years of uncertainty, or the ache of longing that ran through almost everything he did. They just know the story. And the story is enough. It was always enough. That is the life of Hans Christian Andersen, a life that began very small and opened, slowly and steadily, into something vast and lasting. A life full of longing and persistence, and work and travel, and beauty, and sadness, and underneath all of it, an extraordinary love of the world. He saw it clearly. He felt it deeply, and he found a way to give what he saw and felt back to the rest of us, in a form simple enough for a child to hold. and deep enough for the rest of a life. Thank you for spending this evening with Bedtime Biographies. If you're still here, let yourself rest now. The story is finished. The night is quiet. And somewhere, in the gentle dark, the tales are still going. Good night.